Well, hey everybody, JW Franz here again from DecisionPoint Technologies. As always, it's been a real pleasure for me personally to be able to join this platform, whether I'm a participant as I am here today or just a listener in. But also really excited to have the opportunity again to kind of help talk on this series Beyond the Barcode. And for those of you that may have been with us just a few weeks ago, I was fortunate at that time to have had the opportunity to talk with one of my friends and industry colleagues, Randy Dunn from Zebra Technologies. And similarly to this time around, I get to join another person that I call a friend, one that I've known in the industry for now a few years. That being Jonathan Aitken, Jonathan from PVH. So, Jonathan, before I ask you to do a little background and introduce yourself, our relationship started, it's crazy to think, 3.5 years ago, roughly
Yep.
speaking, whenever I joined Barcoding Inc., now DecisionPoint Technologies. And at that time, I really only knew you working through Avery Dennison. But obviously, you have a lot more history than just working at Avery. You come from a background with Lululemon, and now you're at PVH, being very well known these days as their RFID guy. But since that really doesn't do justice to kind of really who you are and your background, can you help the audience better understand a little bit more about you and your role today?
Yeah, sure. So Jonathan Aitken, I'm the VP of Global on Product Technology at PVH Corp. PVH owns the Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger brands. And so I've been with PVH for almost a year. It'll be a year next week. So, and like you said, prior to that, I worked at Avery Dennison and for 7 years managing software and hardware partnerships with their RFID tag business. And then prior to that, I actually worked for Lululemon in a variety of different roles over a 6 year period, and the last two or three were around deploying RFID and then working as the director of retail for IT. So now I'm actually on the supply chain team. I'm not on the IT team, but I have a dotted line into IT. But I also have a background going back to working at Accenture. I worked at actually a military contractor where we did a lot of very strict project management. So I've done a lot of project management work in my life, project and program management. I also have an MBA from the University of Utah and an undergraduate degree in engineering from Stanford. So, been following RFID for a really long time. So it's kind of an exciting area that I've always kind of wanted to spend a lot of time in.
Well, naturally, your history then warrants the RFID guy title. So,
Yeah.
how long has it been now since you got that title? I first heard it when we were at NRF at the beginning of the year.
Well, it's funny because I joined like almost a year ago, but when I was talking to one of the new CFOs that we had in Europe, he was joking and he said, "Well, I was wondering who our RFID guy was." And the joke is like we actually have a really high level of RFID, what my friend Marshall K calls RFIQ. Like we certainly know a lot about it, at least in certain areas, like in the retail store area in particular. So, but yeah, so that was kind of the joke. So, my title is VP of Global on Product Technology, but it's like, so I just put in brackets the RFID guy, and now it's sort of like stuck.
That's yeah, yeah, and even you just mentioned Marshall. There's another gentleman who I have come to appreciate a lot. I've was just with him at the RELA event just 2 weeks ago now, so we had some good conversations. So I think you've already added the next person to put in my queue for being on this series with me. So thanks for that little reminder.
Definitely. Definitely. He's a fellow Canadian. So, Canadians walk amongst you. You don't know, but he and I went to a hockey game along with JP Campbell, who's another Canadian at the RFID Journal Live. So it was exciting.
Yeah, yeah, you mentioned the other one, JP. So assuming these guys will be listening at some point, I'm going to nominate them to join as you have here in
Definitely.
the future. So thank you. But well, no, I didn't really want to make this a just a catch up about you and PVH, but I think certainly your history that you kind of just summarized, and your background has really made you a thought leader in this space that a lot of people can appreciate, to the direction you're taking,
Hmm.
PVH, just things you're doing in the industry. So now I was just kind of curious, maybe if you can help me understand, because again, we don't get to catch up as much as we used to.
Yeah.
If you take in all of your history now over the years and being the RFID guy, which I'm going to keep using that term during this conversation, but how is that kind of helping influence some of the work you're doing today, over the next, year or so?
Well, so I'm involved with all aspects of RFID. So I have teams working on it across the different parts, not just parts of the business, but also different regions of the world. So we're deploying into our retail stores in various phases in North America, in Europe, and in Asia. But we have some in our distribution centers, but we're looking at enhancing that. And then we're also kicking off one of the first in the world, really at scale, RFID scan and pack solutions in partnership with InfoNexus. And
Right.
the kind of funny thing about that is my very first day at Avery Dennison in 2017, I started this project with PVH, and then it kind of slowed down during the COVID period. And so now we're kind of accelerating rapidly, and we've got about 40 factories already that are up and running, and we're going to be rolling out to 400 more. And so the idea with that is that you're actually verifying what's inside the carton with RFID. So, the tags are good, that the cartons have what they said is supposed to be in it. And so, because a lot of times you only inspect a certain percentage of the cartons when it goes into a DC, and then a lot of stores are even just doing blind receiving. And so like verifying that early on and making sure that it's correct and that the tags are working correctly is hugely valuable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think maybe I learned something, or maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. So your past life at Avery helped influence some of the things you were directly doing.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah. So I managed the partnership with InfoNexus and Avery Dennison. So they've had a long partnership going back almost 20 years, where Avery had sold some software to a previous incarnation of InfoNexus, which was Trade
right.
Card that merged with GT Nexus. And ironically, like when I was at Lululemon, we had InfoNexus or we had Trade Card and GT Nexus, and I worked on the GT Nexus project for a while. So I've kind of been involved with various incarnations of people
Right.
at InfoNexus for a long time as well. And like you, I consider like Jeff Roy at Infor a good friend, and every time he comes to New York, we get a chance to go for dinner and kind of talk about it. But it's quite interesting now. There's lots of other brands that are starting to roll out this RFID scan attack because they're really seeing the value in the factories.
Yeah, no, very cool, especially how things kind of come full circle as you've
Yeah.
kind of changed in career. But obviously, with PVH and things you're doing, you're doing a lot over as you will continue to do so. Is the scan and pack that the one thing that you can say that kind of quote unquote like excites you every day, or is there something else that
The thing that excites me is actually like educating other people about RFID, because even though, like I said, we have this high level of RFIQ, it's in isolated pockets, and it's also like, oh, I know store like back to front replenishment, or I know the Omnichannel piece, but a lot of people say, oh yeah, I know RFID, and then you start asking questions, and they really don't. They think it's more like an air tag, and they think that like as soon as you tag it, then you know where everything is across your whole fleet. And so it's like explaining, no, it's passive, it's low cost, it doesn't use a phone to get the information. You have to have specific readers at choke points. Because we've had a lot of conversations of like, oh, this product got diverted into a channel we don't want it to go. It has a tag on it. You should be able to tell me where it happened. And I was like, yeah, 5 years from now, when we have everything that I've laid out on our plan, yes, we'll be able to do that. But today we can't quite do that because we don't have comprehensive scanning inbound and outbound, in particular in our distribution centers.
right. And I know that you and I, again, we stay in touch, and sometimes I get to hear some things from you sooner than later. But
Yeah.
what is like, RFID is an evolution, as we know. It's not a one-time investment. It's not a one and done type thing. So as it matures within your organization and you look for new use cases, like if you can share, like what's the next big pain point you're trying to solve for?
I think the next big pain point is actually EPCIS software to tie it all together. And so EPCIS is like a standard created by GS1 that allows you to create events that are RFID based. So it's like one level below the each, right down to the serialized level, and knowing where all that goes. And so the software that we have for our stores is RFID based, but it's not EPCIS based, unfortunately. And so now we want to tie in, like I mentioned, the RFID scan and pack, and then RFID in our DCs, push all that information into some sort of a parallel bar that's running in parallel to our ERP systems, but gives you a global source of inventory across that, regardless of the status of where it is. Even, long term, potentially even knowing what we have available at our wholesale partners. But, right now we just sort of like ship it to the wholesalers, and that's pretty much the last time we see it. And so it'd be nice to be able to know more about it, because eventually, you could see potentially wanting to be able to sell across multiple channels, including if you have a hot selling product and there's some available in another market, we'd rather that our wholesale partners got to sell that through the excitement that our brand brings.
Right, right. No, and like I said, this is all very cool, man. I always love to hear what you're doing, and certainly, some of the things you mentioned, like EPCIS, or things that I take a personal interest in. So, as much as I like to keep talking about it, I won't. I'll hold to what I say. I won't make this conversation about you and PVH. So, if I was to kind of like pivot a little bit, 2025, it seems like for me at least personally, the first half of any year is always trade show heavy, whether it's trade shows or sales kickoffs. And I know that you and I were both at NRF at the beginning of the year. And then I mentioned myself and Randy Dunn, who I had just met with here a few weeks ago. He and I were at the Auburn RFID Summit in April. As I mentioned earlier, I was at the RELA loss detection asset protection event last week in DC. You were, I think, at RFID Journal Live last week. So, take those few examples of trade shows that I've been to, you've been to, and I'm sure there's others you've been to that I didn't even account for. But like, what have you been kind of hearing consistent this year that maybe we hadn't heard in shows past years?
Yeah, I mean, I think RFID continues to accelerate and become kind of like table stakes. And as you start to see really large brands that were kind of on the edge now adopting, like Old Navy and Gap Inc., I mean, that's huge, right? To see those kinds of brands doing it. But, it was interesting. I also saw people from Decathlon at RFID Journal, and Decathlon has been using RFID technology for 15 years, and they are all in RFID everywhere, not just RFID self-checkouts, which they're kind of famous for, but they use it, like you mentioned, loss detection. They've got it, all throughout their supply chain. And they have it so they can actually make intelligent decisions based off of RFID, how to actually ship product. If it's a hot seller, they'll accelerate it and ship it by air. If it's not selling, then they'll continue to ship it by ground or by ocean. And so like those kinds of things are really important, and making, some of them are really, helps being powered by RFID. But the other thing that I've seen a lot just recently by visiting some of our stores is we're starting to see store associates who, in retail, a store associate may go from, one brand to another. And so we've seen people now coming into stores and it's like, hey, where I used to work, I used to work at Superdry or whatever, and they had RFID there, and now I've got it here, and they had this feature. How come we can't have this feature? And so I love going to stores too to hear that, because you really got a chance to hear it from the people that are actually like on the ground and doing stuff. So we're doing some really cool things like single sign-on. So store associates can just log on with their username, and we use the store Wi-Fi as our two-factor authentication for that. So that's kind of neat, as opposed to having like a passcode on your secondary phone or anything like that. Right. So there's some really cool things that our teams have done to be able to manage around that. But the other thing I think is just now people know the basic use cases. In-store replenishment, updating your ERP is kind of a hot one actually this year. At Auburn, I believe Gina from Carter's and her team were talking about, using RFID for their physical inventory, which is something that is on my goals as well. Right. But, we're multinational, many countries, and we don't have RFID everywhere. So that's going to take some time. But at least in North America, that's our goal to get that done, as well as in Europe. So, and then obviously Omnichannel, right? Omnichannel is never going to go away. And Omnichannel is like table stakes now. It's almost like, how can you sell from Instagram or something? Because that's where people are spending most of their time. So, how can you go from like Instagram to a website to make a sale to like know exactly what you've got to help drive that demand? So, that's something that I definitely see kind of continuing to evolve as well.
Very cool. And it was funny you mentioned Instagram, because my wife sent me something today, and text, and it was an Instagram link. I'm like, well, I don't do Instagram. She's like, well, you got to get with the times. So
I mean, they're really, the next level thing is deep links within Instagram. So it's not just like, oh, I'm going to take you to Tommy Hilfiger, but I'm going to take you to this, right? And so, influencers, I'm not sure how we do it at PVH, but I remember at Lululemon, we actually had a whole stack of influencers, and we were paying them commissions on what they were able to drive to the website. So it's not something that is they just do out of the goodness of their hearts or to get feeds and stuff. Like it's a business for them.
Yeah, no, it's a different world, one that I don't follow that aspect of it much, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
at least. But no, one thing I just want to mention too, because you were talking about store associates and what some associates now are expecting to have in terms of to support
Hmm.
their daily operation or whatever. But I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, JP recently wrote an article on LinkedIn that talked about how technology is enabling like store associate training to help fast track them to
Hmm.
do their job better. So it made, as you were talking about that, it made me think about that article that I just read.
Definitely. And look at one of the biggest adopters of RFID in the US is Walmart US, right? And they, in their app, they built it all themselves. It has training, it's gamified, and so they can compete with other people in their stores about how good their RFID counts are, and also against other stores in their region. And then I don't know if they've got actual prizes or if it's just like, store spirit, but that aspect of it I think is really interesting.
Yeah, no, very cool stuff. And then the only other thing I want to ask about too, because I sadly I missed it because I was not able to be at Journal Live last week, and the
Hmm.
reason I bring it up is I believe you also were a presenter there on a panel discussion maybe of sorts. So can you maybe just kind of
Yeah.
ask kind of what that was about?
Well, I was actually on two different panels because I was on one with GS1 where we were just kind of talking about it was me, Steve from Brooks, who was talking about RFID in their DC, which was kind of interesting, and then Gina from Carter's, and so talking about that, and then the whole idea was just kind of continuing to talk about the evolution of RFID in retail, and
Right.
like it is kind of table stakes, but one of the things that Dr. Bill Hargrave, who was the monitor or the moderator of the panel, he's sort of like the grandfather of retail RFID in North America and helped found the lab at Arkansas, which then moved to Auburn. But he was there, and he kind of hit home really again on the EPCIS kind of database, and so like I'd kind of like put that on the back burner a little bit before going to journal, so it kind of like reignited that, like, hey, we got to kick that off again. And the fourth person on the panel was actually Hans Peter Scheidt from C&A, which is a big German-based retailer, and they actually have an EPCIS database. And it's funny because Hans Peter shared with me a while ago this slide that talks about all the different things that they've integrated with it. And so I've now just put that in I have a deck that I share with people called RFID 101 that is kind of like an education deck for people. And it's like, okay, this is all the different things we need to do.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, from what I saw on LinkedIn, you and I share some similar network people in our network, and there was a lot of sharing out there. What was
Mhm.
discussed? Looked like there was a lot of knowledge share out there, to say the least.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was definitely a good session. GS1 hosted a lunch just for retailers as well, which I'd gone to in the past. But now that I'm back as a retailer, I get to attend again, and so it was nice to see some of the people from GS1 and get a chance to talk to a few of the other retailers who were in the audience as well.
Very cool. Well, look, I don't know if it applied as much to journal. I mean, it applies to trade shows that again we talked about, which there's a lot of technology advancements. There's a lot of providers out there that are bringing new technologies and solutions to market, and then you see this
Hmm.
world of sensor fusion with RFID and vision and AI and
Yeah,
robotics and everything else. So, with all that stuff that's out there, I mean,
yeah,
and obviously
there's a lot.
we don't want to talk about just RFID all the time, even though we enjoy it so much. What are some of the other things that you're seeing that's coming to market that you think is that sits very nicely with RFID, or just things that personally have gotten your attention, regardless?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of people trying to innovate around loss prevention in various ways, both RFID for loss prevention, and there's other people trying to leapfrog it. There's certainly an emphasis on location as well, and using either Bluetooth beacons or other things, but also using RFID for doing locationing. And so there's like two or three different competing technologies out there now that are starting to get some traction on that.
Right.
And you're starting to see, like I mentioned, one of the brands earlier, Old Navy, that's going to be rolling out location-based technology with RFID. And so I've actually had conversations with CIOs today and saying, like, I want to skip handhelds and move to the next generation. And so, my question is, all right, like do the math. So just make sure that you're committed to that capital, and what's the crossover in terms of labor savings versus location based, and does it work for you? And I think it does work for Old Navy. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. But
Yeah.
they have a big focus on omnichannel in their back of the store and fulfilling a lot of products out of their own stores. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's one. And obviously, you mentioned robotics. I mean, when I was at Avery Dennison, I kind of took it on to take a look at a bunch of different robot companies. And Decathlon, like I mentioned before, has got a couple different robots that they've been testing in the US. When Decathlon had a store in San Francisco, they partnered with a Bay Area startup called Simbi that has gotten a lot of traction in grocery, but they also have some RFID antennas and readers that are built into their robot. A lot of that really depends on the kind of store that you are. So Kmart, which is still a brand that exists in Australia, it's like a license of that brand. They have actually rolled out RFID robots across their stores, but it's a big box retailer. They don't have a lot of back of house. Pretty much everything that they have is on the floor. So, and it's an everyday low price. So like they're always looking to make sure that they have the correct inventory and make sure that availability. But interesting enough, they actually had to partner with a handheld with a custom software developer out of Germany to kind of get into the corners a little bit where the robot wasn't getting into. So it was kind of an interesting thing to know more about that. So, but and then of course there's artificial intelligence, right? And so, I mean, I think you can't get on any podcast without talking about AI today, and you have to get on Instagram because I see these ads for men over 50, and it's like either a fitness thing or it's like, hey, you're old and you need to learn about AI. But it is pretty interesting. Like I am using AI daily now in my life to help write documents, write PowerPoint slides, help with crafting like a tone of an email, because you can do all kinds of things, just like rewrite this in a friendlier tone.
Yeah.
So, but it is really interesting. But I actually just attended an AI in retail webinar, and one of the things that they were talking about was you can do things like better allocations or pricing decisions or assortments, and I'm thinking like, yeah, and you would work even better if you had accurate inventory from powered by RFID to help make those decisions. So in my mind, I don't think you could do AI without doing RFID, because I think you would be kind of missing out a little bit. But the next level of AI, they're calling it agentic AI, where it's an agent. And so then it's much more of an interactive kind of a thing where you can, ask it to do scenarios. And so I think that's, we're still on the early days of this AI revolution. And yeah. The last AI one that's used a lot in retailers, there's a company called Placer AI that we use at PVH, and it uses location data from your smartphone apps like Instagram to give brands competitive information about foot traffic. And so they've mapped a mall, the store location of the mall, and then they get the cell phone data precisely from where you are in the mall. So if you go into a Ralph Lauren, you go into an H&M, you go into whatever of these stores, they know probably even better than the traffic cameras that those stores have what the foot traffic is. And it's pretty amazing. So we get reports every morning or every morning after the weekend from Placer AI that tells you the foot traffic that's happened in your stores and in your competitor stores. And then you can see, okay, we had a bad weekend, but so did they. So it's not just us. So that helps you again with your brand assortments. Like, okay, we don't necessarily need to do some pricing adjustments because that's not necessarily, it was like the weather or whatever, like different, it's a macro event. It's not necessarily. So it allows our teams who can make those decisions, to make better decisions.
Yeah, no, very cool. And as we're talking about AI and robotics and everything else, I mean, there's, I'm following a lot of things out there, different OEMs, different technology providers. I mean, companies like Keon and Badger have their versions of RFID enabled robots. I saw, Badger just released their new version, which does a lot more than just RFID, which is really cool to see what they're doing in that space, which is more so focused in grocery right now than anything, as I understand it. But then
exactly.
But then
because that's where the cameras come in, right? Because grocery doesn't have RFID for the most part. So there are some grocers that are starting to do RFID in specific cases, like bakery, or also like some grocers in Europe actually they sell clothing in the grocery stores, right, which is kind of a bit of a foreign thing here. But so it's like a mix, and so you're starting to see that too. And like companies like BJ's, you're starting to see RFID rolled out in there as well.
Yeah, and then the other cool thing I saw, which had nothing to do with robotics at this point, but it was again that sensor fusion, that blending of technologies, was a company called iFi, and what they're doing with vision and RFID and AI.
Hmm.
There's so much cool stuff that's out there. But again, I could take us down a rabbit hole because I know we both like to talk about
Yeah.
this. But one of the things I want to ask you about, because we've talked so much about RFID and we kind of broke away for a little bit talking about AI and robotics and such, but
Hmm.
the series is clearly titled Beyond the Barcode. So we're
Hmm.
so we're not talking about traditional 1D barcode here, but at these different events that you and I are at, there's clearly a lot of talk about serialized data carriers. There's a lot of talk
Yep.
about QR codes, digital link, Sunrise 2027.
Yep.
I very much enjoy hearing people like Chuck Lasley from Dillard's speak, and he's been very vocal about what Dillard's is doing in QR codes and serialized POS
Right.
data. But how does all that stuff kind of how do you
Yeah.
how to apply to like PVH and some of the things you're working on?
Well, so we have a big wholesale business as well as a big retail business. And so, we're quite sensitive to that balance that it brings. Like, in consumer engagement, should we be putting a QR code on in a Macy's store that, brings it to our brand versus, it should go to Macy's website. And so there are some really cool things you can do with QR code technology going forward. And the GS1 digital link is obviously the big one for Sunrise 2027.
Right.
One thing that I think a lot of companies are still struggling with is where to put the QR code, where to put the RFID tag, and do you do it on the same one or on different ones or whatever. And so, we are at the point right now where, for at least the short term, we're having a sewn-in QR code that will be European Digital Product Passport compliant, but then also having a parallel QR code on our hang tags. And I struggle with that because I'm not sure it's the right answer, but I also don't want to have a store associate having to, because we still scan with barcodes that are checkout,
Sure.
dig into something to find a QR code to scan, right? And so, like, we're still going to have a barcode anyway. So it's like we're on this journey, and you're always going to have a transition as well where your POS is going to have to read like multiple types of data,
Yeah.
right? And so one of the people that I met at the GS1 lunch that I was talking about at RFID Journal was actually a fellow from, he's the CTO of Dillard's, Chuck Lasley. And so he is actively pursuing adopting the GS1 digital link. And I'm sure at GS1 Connect, you'll hear a lot more about it because I'm pretty sure he's going to talk about it. So I don't want to steal his thunder, but I said to him, I was like, well, do you want us to start putting this on? Because we're a customer of yours, but we haven't heard this requirement from you yet. And he's like, oh yeah, I would like to do that. I was like, well, we should get that communicated so then I can, because that'll help me too. When we started our RFID journey, the reason we started it was because Macy's asked us to do it, right? And then we started doing it in our own stores. And so, like, these are kinds of things that will start to, push it. It's a mandate comes from the retailer back to the brands. The brands will, sometimes begrudgingly, as we've seen with RFID, but at least start to adopt this. But yeah, for sure.
Yeah, well, so we both mentioned Chuck, and that's where I first met him. I heard him speak last year. Was at GS1 Connect, so I'm
Got it.
looking forward to it here just next month in Nashville. So, the other thing I'm going to ask you that too, because I know we live in a world of acronyms, and the other one that ties into all of this is we haven't talked about Digital Product Passport (DPP).
Yeah.
Since you all are kind of selling and into the European market and such, where does that
Yeah.
sit in your lens as well? DPP.
So we have a massive operation in Europe. I mean, our European headquarters is in Amsterdam. We're actually in the Surpass pilot, or both Surpass 1 and the sequel, Surpass 2. And we've been experimenting with that. And so we're using the GS1 digital link for that. In our pilot, it's just a digital link. It's not connected to RFID, but that's what I was saying, like longer term, we want to connect those things together. And you're starting to see some really interesting advances. Like this is actually a sample that we got from one of our vendors that has an RFID tag, but it also has a QR code. And when you scan the QR, it has the same serial number that's on the RFID. And so you're starting to see this. And so you can sort of switch modalities between your supply chain. So you could start, rapid scanning with RFID where you're doing it in bulk, and then you could switch to one-to-one scanning, but still connect all that stuff into your EPCIS database, right, to have that going across your whole supply chain.
Yeah, no, that's another one that I get a lot of excitement around, is seeing me learning about that and its evolution, because obviously it's not just going to be a European thing. It's going to, it's going to move in other regions as time goes on. But I know that we're getting to our time here. So one of the things I want to ask is, because we've talked about so many things from regulatory mandates, or
Yeah.
like DPP, or we talk about different technologies, and whether it's RFID, automation, you name it. Like, you take this whole conversation and you kind of really
Yeah.
condense it down to someone that's really, in the early stages of this journey with RFID, because it's not, like I said, not a one and done. What are some of the things,
Hmm.
what are some of the recommendations you can make to help people kind of navigate that landscape of providers when they're starting to look at how to best utilize these technologies and solutions?
Well, I think there's a couple of different recommendations. Number one is start with start RFID tagging now. So like start to get that flow through your supply chain, because it takes 6, 9, 12, 24 months potentially to get everything tagged. So uh, and what's most painful is these sort of tag up parties, that having to tag things up within your DC and within your supply chain. And it's also very expensive. So I just saw an estimate of what it's going to take, because we've got inventory in Europe or in Asia that's not tagged, because we just started tagging. And so I wish we'd started even earlier.
Right.
But the other recommendation is to put that QR code on, because eventually you're going to want to do checkout at your POS using either RFID self checkout or some sort of RFID equipment. And you mentioned Keon today. We have a lot of Keons deployed within our environment, but there's a cost to deploy them, and you also have to, for us, we've cut a hole in our POS, the table where our POS is in the counter, and so and we've sunk it in there because we want to see some status lights and things like that. And so, but if you just had QR scanning, you could just scan the QR code instead, because you could still capture the serial number and do what you needed to do, which is push it to the exit gates, push that information back into your RFID software to do that inventory decrementing. So definitely, those are my two recommendations from that point of view. My other recommendation is, talk to references. Make sure you actually understand the good and bad of each of the RFID software platforms that are out there and how they scale, because there's scalability as you start to grow and everyone starts cycle counting at one particular time of day. So, make sure they're on the right cloud thing that can scale up and scale down to keep your costs effective, but also make sure that your stores aren't complaining, because the worst thing is when a store start calling and saying, well, I'm not doing RFID because, the software is not being responsive.
Yeah, no, all great points. And I guess the last thing I would add is, one of the things I've come to very much appreciate about the industry as a whole is, and I say this all the time, is everyone's really there to help each other out. Even though there's competitiveness across retailers and whatnot, it seems like industry really generally has, problems they're all trying to solve collectively and collaboratively.
Yeah, and I think in general, like retailers have been really good, and we're doing this across, not just RFID, but other like POS. One of my good friends who lives in New York, just like 3 blocks from me, I met him at a POS conference, because we both, when we were at Lululemon, were using the same POS software, and so I still talk to him all the time. And because he lives pretty close to me, we go out from time to time. But yeah, I mean, I think the one exception to that is the hardware, RFID hardware. Not all RFID hardware works with all RFID software. And so, I call that the dirty secret of RFID. So, just be careful who you pick. So a good example is we switched software platforms in Europe, and all of our handhelds continued to work, which was great. But we also had a ton of fixed infrastructure that did not work. And so, that's kind of a challenge of, how that fixed infrastructure, our new software providers like, well, it's not certified by us. We don't, we're not sure if you're going to get the right level of read rates. We prefer to put our own hardware in. And I'm like, well, yeah, of course you'd like to sell me, $5 million worth of new hardware. So that's always a challenge.
Yeah, no, all good points, and appreciate it. Well, look, I know that we've been talking for quite a while, and I always enjoy talking to you and love to talk longer.
Yeah.
Time won't permit, but I do got one last question, which is,
Yeah.
just both share personal interests. Cycling and I know that
Mhm.
you go on all these cycling trips that I'm very jealous of. I guess my
Yeah.
question for you would be is the Tour de France. You gonna be watching that? It's coming up.
Well, so funny you asked. So this, you can't really see this glass, but it says Tour de France. But my wife actually gave this to me. But it says it's for the 100th anniversary. So it's from 1903 to 2003. So I've had this glass for this pint glass for 22 years. So yeah, I've been a cyclist for a long time. There's so many different things you can do, like coach cycling. There's Grand Fondos. There's all kinds of different things. one of your questions I saw you were asking earlier was like, what's the correlation between RFID and cycling? And like most of these large events use RFID tags for timing, race
Right.
timing, right? And not just beginning and end, but now they've got these like intermediates, like how fast can you go up this hill, or that they don't do how fast you can go down because they don't want to promote dangerous behavior. But going up is like that's like super fast or whatever. So you see that, and they've got RFID readers, and you kind of see that there. But I also think, some of the inventory challenges that we saw during COVID, the bike industry just got hammered because all of a sudden you couldn't do anything, but people wanted to go outside. You couldn't go to the gym. So like the cycling industry just exploded, and there was inventory outages everywhere. And
Right.
so, proper handling of that. So my bike club that I'm a member of in Vancouver, where I live part time, is the owner of it. I know because he's in my club. He actually was asking me about, could you use RFID for taking inventory of your store, because he was just complaining how he had just had to do annual inventory for a store, and it took him and his staff like 12 hours overnight to do it. And I was like, what if I told you you could do this in like an hour, and you could do it every week if you wanted to maintain it. And so I actually brought him some sample RFID tags that I had and kind of explained it to him. But like a lot of small businesses, like, it's hard to get started sometimes.
Yeah.
But, one of the things that's really interesting is, in my previous role at Avery Dennison, I managed a lot of partnerships, and one of them was Shopify. We started talking to them. So they don't have an RFID solution, but they have an open partner network, and there are several RFID providers that have a Shopify partnership. And so if you go to Shopify's website and you look in their partners, you can see that there's a couple in there. And then the one that I know of that's actually not in there, ironically, is Riot RFID. And Darren Williams, who runs Riot, he told me that if he gives your Shopify like GUID your ID, and if you give that to him, he will connect it to his systems, and you could be up and running in 48 hours as a small business.
Oh.
So that's pretty huge. Like you hear of RFID deployments taking weeks and weeks, but he's got it. Like most of his customers have 1 or 2 or 3 store locations. And so he actually surprisingly has a lot of small businesses that are doing RFID, and it's fairly reasonable if you just have a couple of store locations, right?
Yeah, and that's awesome for to fill that I don't want to say that void, but a market that a lot of people are not necessarily focused on. So that's awesome. But
yeah, well, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small companies, right?
yeah,
So yeah,
exactly. Well, no, like I said, I appreciate all the time. It's always good to catch up with you, and
great to talk to you as always, JW.
yeah, and hopefully I'll see you at an upcoming event here sooner than later, so we can meet non-virtually for a change.
Yeah, it's always good to talk to you virtually, but it's always nice to see you in person. Thanks
All
for
right.
your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate it, and I'll talk to you soon.